Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you could please find your way to your seats, we'll begin in just a moment. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Brittany McGee, and I'm the Next Generation Officer here at the Council. It is my pleasure to see you all this evening and to welcome you to our last Young Professionals program, and in fact, the very last Council program of 2017. We're in for a fantastic discussion this evening on the rise of the newly notorious technology, the blockchain. What is the blockchain and what do we do with it? Well, hopefully in an hour, I will be able to tell you. But a few housekeeping points before we begin. Tonight's program is live and on the record, so please silence your phones, but be sure to keep them at the ready, as we'll be taking questions through our online survey technology, the link to which you can find on the screen on either side of me. Simply type chi.cnf.io into your device browser and select tonight's program to submit your question for consideration. Also, don't forget to engage with us on social media and use hashtag CouncilYP in your posts. As you're tweeting, though, know that views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views on the Council. So if you lose your life savings purchasing Bitcoin, we are certainly not liable, my friends. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. We engage not only the nation and world's top leaders, but also Chicago's next generation of leaders, with programming to increase your global fluency and cultural competence. I encourage you, if you're not a member with us, to join tonight. We have signups in the back, and of course, if you do join, I want you to be a part of our Young Professionals Network. We have memberships for students beginning at $40, and membership increases as do benefits. I also welcome all of you to stay immediately following the program for some holiday cheer at our Young Professionals meetup, so we'll be right in the back of the room following the program. Back to tonight. The promise of the blockchain has been vast. It's a disruptor, it's a digital revolution, and possibly the great equalizer. The not-so-new technology kid on the block is also posing a challenge to the traditional trust machine and reshaping the way we think about institutions, information, and transactions. To elucidate some of this for us tonight, we have a fantastic panel. Mark Balin is the creator of Bounty's Network, a freelancing platform that facilitates transactions paying for any task in Ethereum token. Bounty's Network is one of the companies at Consensus, a venture production studio that creates meaningful blockchain applications across all industries. Mark also founded ETH Waterloo, the world's largest Ethereum hackathon, and runs meetups for Ethereum in Waterloo, Canada. Mark studied computer science at the University of Waterloo and business administration at Wilfrid Laurier University. Jennifer O'Rourke is the Deputy Director of the Office of Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Technology at the Illinois Department of Commerce. She also serves as the Illinois Blockchain Business Liaison, as well as a board member in the FinTech Incubator Currency. Jennifer holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois and a master's from the University of London. Kai Wu is the Data Project Manager at Morningstar. There he leads all blockchain projects and is driving Morningstar's company-wide blockchain strategy. Kai holds a Bachelor's of Science in Organizational Behavior Studies from Northwestern University. And moderating tonight's discussion is Council Senior Fellow Phil Levy. Phil's writing and research focuses on the global economy and in particular, economic relations with China. He's a regular contributor to Forbes and Foreign Policy magazines, and his academic writings have appeared in the American Economic Review and the Journal of International Economics. Phil holds a PhD in economics from Stanford University and a bachelor's from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
All right, good evening, everyone. Well, I'm not going to beat around the bush too much because we've got a lot of interesting stuff to talk about and not a ton of time to talk about it in. I think, as you heard in the introduction, the first thing that comes to mind when anyone talks about sort of blockchain is Bitcoin and how many thousands of dollars did it go up today. But that's not where we're going to start. We're going to try to actually start at the beginning and figure out, we will sort of touch on, is this just cryptocurrencies or is this something more than cryptocurrencies that one can do? But I wanted to start by, the technology underlying this is blockchain. What is blockchain? You want to?
Yeah, I can start. So in 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto, person or group, we don't really know, it's a pseudonym, came up with this white paper introducing the Bitcoin protocol. And in it, he outlined what would be a blockchain, basically a peer-to-peer decentralized network to serve as a decentralized manner for people to confirm state. And to incentivize people to confirm state. And so Bitcoin obviously used this to confirm the state of a ledger, right? So how many coins does each individual have? But a blockchain, all it does is this mechanism to have a bunch of parties who don't necessarily trust each other agree on the current state of some application or database. So blockchains obviously are very applicable in the context of ledgers, but often have a lot of other use cases beyond that.
So I wouldn't have imagined, if you had asked me back then, that this was a desperate crying need that we needed to sort of go confirm state. Why is this a need? What does this sort of get at that we couldn't do before?
Yeah, so I think that an interesting way of looking at the true value proposition of the utility of this technology is through the lens of trust. So if you think about the way in which you conduct business transactions, you do not necessarily trust all of the parties that are participants in the transaction. So to solve for that, over the course of the past few decades, we've put trusted institutions in the middle of those transactions. So for example, when you buy a house, you have lawyers, brokers, mortgage agents, you have title insurance, and all of them are essentially solving for one particular segment of me selling my house to someone else, but just one piece of that, and putting someone in the middle of that one piece, whether it's the debt I take on to sell the house, the state of the house, and the debt attached to that asset when I'm buying it. There's someone standing in the middle of that transaction to say, Jennifer doesn't trust the buyer, so I'm going to verify for both parties that the information that Jennifer's getting and the seller is giving is accurate. But when you think about the practical application of putting an intermediary in front of, or rather in the middle of, all of these various segments of one singular transaction, it becomes very time consuming and it becomes very expensive. And we might not actually realize that because we're so accustomed to all the ways in which we as a society have essentially put Band-Aids and Band-Aids and Band-Aids upon these really large problems of, I don't trust you, but I want to do business with you. And before blockchain, we actually didn't have a way in which technology was mature enough to solve for this trust issue. But because of blockchain and the utility that the technology provides, now we can solve for this trustworthiness by allowing the technology as a platform to play that role of providing everyone one standard gold copy version of a transaction, of a record, and allowing all these multiple participants to see that same version or that same status at the same time and know that the information that I'm getting as a buyer or that my seller is giving me as a seller, the debt that's attached to an asset from a bank or from a government tax agency is actually what I've been told it is, and I don't need a third party to come in and tell me that's the truth.
So I like this framing of trust, but let me sort of turn this back and say, is blockchain trustworthy? We hear about sort of computer hacking all the time. You hear about institutions that are at least affiliated through Bitcoin mostly, but Mt. Gox and the like. Should we trust blockchain?
Well, I think blockchain has proven itself over time based off of how it's been run. If you look at platforms like Bitcoin and Ethereum, what you see is that these are platforms that are running in the public with open source technology that anyone can see the source code to. And for a platform like Bitcoin, you've never, over the course of the 9 or so years that it's been around, the underlying protocol hasn't actually been hacked. There have been various examples of the applications built on top of Bitcoin being hacked or applications built on top of Ethereum being hacked, but it's important to separate out what is these applications being built on top and how secure they are versus the underlying cryptocurrency and the underlying protocol. Because I think that distinction right there helps us determine this question of, is it trustworthy? Because from a security standpoint, the underlying protocol is extremely trustworthy. I think an analogy that a lot of people use is the ATM system and credit cards. When you get your credit card number stolen, is that a problem of the system of credit cards, or is it just a problem with the particular security that you're putting in your credit card information on a website or things like that? So I think it's just helpful with this new technology. It's very easy to conflate the two between what is the platform and what is actually the application. And I think a lot of times that's what's going on when people are questioning the security.
Okay, so we're thinking about block form, we're thinking about the platform. You mentioned sort of public. Where do we think of this as residing? Is this a public thing? Is this a private thing? Is this a meaningful distinction as we think about this?
So I think that, like the internet in the early days, we had private internets, intranets, and we had, later the public internet. And obviously with blockchains, we started public, and we see companies and organizations coming together to build private iterations between competitors, sometimes coming together and consortia coming together to say, we don't necessarily trust each other, but it would obviously be much more efficient for us to work together on the same platform. So, in the interim, obviously we have this very strong distinction between public and private chains, but I think over the next 5 years we'll see sort of a bridging of those two, where you can have applications that live on private networks interacting with the public network and vice versa, the same bidirectional communications between two chains. So right now it becomes a big distinction, especially for companies looking to build on the technology. Should I build on private? Should I build on public? But I think in the next 5 years we'll learn that it's actually not an important distinction, and it'll be meaningless to decide between them.
So I think a different way of thinking about this too is thinking of blockchain as a layer of technologies, not just one single technology. Because when a lot of people talk about blockchain, they tend to think of exactly what Mark was talking about. It's just a distributed database that collectively confirms transactions. But a lot of times when people are talking about blockchain, it's about a series of applications that are built on top of it. So one layer you could think of as cryptocurrencies, so the Bitcoins and Ethereums of the world. Another layer might be decentralized applications that are yet another layer on top of it.
When you say built on top, you mean there's a ledger there, and what do you do with the ledger?
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you think about it, it's very similar to an internet application. So if you think of an internet application, it's built on a database somewhere. Let's use Facebook as an example. Facebook somewhere has a database that tracks whether or not you like it or you interact somewhere with it. It surfaces it through some sort of API that then transfers it somewhere to your browser, so that when you click on it, right, that's what happens, and you actually store the data into that database through that layer of technologies. Blockchain actually works in a similar way, where there's a similar layer of technologies going on, where you have the underlying layer of the blockchain, but then for public applications, you have cryptocurrencies and you have the decentralized applications. And back to what Mark is saying, certain companies, I think the majority of companies right now are really interested in one layer of the technology. Think of this as the base layer, the blockchain, right? But when we think about disruption, when we think about why are people interested in this and why are people paying millions of dollars, billions of dollars to get in this market, it's really about the whole stack. It's really about thinking about, okay, what are all the ways that blockchain can be disruptive? And I think it's important to make sure we're understanding, what is it that a lot of companies are investing in right now, and what are the things that they could be investing in moving forward. And I think that relates to the question of, what is private? And private is really talking about this bottom layer, this blockchain layer. But if you're talking about public blockchain, it's all three layers, right? Because that's what you need in order to build a real public blockchain.
And Kai, another way that I look at this, and I'll just kind of throw this example out there because it's useful for folks who maybe are not as familiar, are not as fluent with the technology, but I like to think, how do I explain this to my Aunt Charlene at Thanksgiving? So yeah. Aunt Charlene asked me.
Did you just do this?
Yeah. Had the pleasure, thank you. And also, what crypto to buy, that's another topic.
Ripple.
But Aunt Charlene says, Jennifer, what's this blockchain stuff you're doing? And I'm like, okay, Aunt Charlene, you have an iPhone. That is the Bitcoin blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain. But the iPhone, without apps on it, doesn't really let you use your iPhone to do too much. So these apps atop the iPhone are these exchanges and digital wallets and smart contracts, and the way that we as end users are really going to interact with the chain is through these applications. Similarly, the way that we interact with apps on our phone as opposed to just the brick of the iPhone.
So you guys are all young, so you get old. So we had this with personal computers in the 80s. It was sort of before you had the killer app or the thing. It was sort of nice that it could compute, and then somebody said, hey, spreadsheet app, and then all of a sudden you could use it for things.
Yeah.
How far advanced are we in people thinking about how to exploit this technology? Are we in these early stages where you've got one or two apps, but all the good stuff's yet to come? Or have people really sort of developed this more than... Most people think cryptocurrency, blockchain. What else is there?
I think a lot of the good stuff is being produced in private. A lot of times, large Fortune 500s are working on this stuff and are building proof of concepts to try and change their businesses and see how they can actually leverage this technology.
Do you have examples?
Supply chain tracking is a big one where I know a lot of different firms are experimenting. Walmart is a big one. In the identity space, digital identity, I know a lot of governments are trying to see how they can possibly move their identity systems onto blockchain type systems. As well, land registries are a really big one, and that's especially has big implications in third world countries where they don't have land registries. But the point is that all these applications are very often running in private contexts and aren't public and aren't running in production yet. And so as time goes on and as these networks mature, they become more trusted. We can actually depend on them to produce more transaction throughput as required to actually power meaningful applications for governments or for big businesses. But in the meantime, we'll see them in research labs and R&D type contexts where we and the public don't really hear about them. So while it's easy to think, it's just the cryptocurrency, no one's really building anything, a lot of really smart people are building some really awesome applications. We just don't know about it yet.
I agree 100%. Just to jump onto that really quick. So within the state of Illinois, we've taken a pronounced position on blockchain in the creation of the Illinois Blockchain Initiative. We have a three-pronged strategy to support Illinois taking a leadership position for the technology, both domestically and internationally. And the last prong of the strategy is the need to integrate the technology into the government itself. So how does the public sector use this technology to better provide our services faster, better, and more securely? And through that lens, we have identified 5 use cases that we are in the process of exploring. And you actually named quite a few. So from land title registries in partnership with Cook County to academic transcripts in partnership with University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, health provider registries with the IMLC and the Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, energy credit marketplaces, which is interesting, and obviously the work that Consensus has done with the smart grid and microgrids in Brooklyn. There's some really cool stuff that is absolutely in play right now. These are not words on a piece of paper or ideas on a computer screen. These are, a combination of hardware and software that is built right now and is leveraging this technology. And then, again, digital identity, which we at the Illinois Blockchain Initiative truly think is going to be the key that really unlocks everything. We're focused on a pilot that uses decentralized IDs and verifiable claims to look at digitalizing a birth certificate in a secure fashion. So that's what we're doing at the state level. I can tell you that there is so much happening in the private sector, it's ridiculous. Now, in terms of when will we as end users be participating with this technology, that's gonna take a little bit of time. And that's really important as we have this discussion to time box this in, however the technology evolves, when are we actually talking about mass adoption and true infrastructure overhaul? There's going to be a little bit of time before we hit those kind of milestones, but I do promise you the private sector is speeding ahead with their proof of concepts and pilots.
So I want to come to each of you in a second about sort of what excites you the most and what you've worked on, but let me, also this is a question that's going to go to you. Where will the public notice it? You said it's a while before they start doing it, but you get records. Do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I did. I actually had a good point here. When I first started getting into blockchain, I did some research on how it compared to the internet bubble, which came up in the early 2000s, and the internet has obviously been a huge part of our lives now. I mean, what you see is that it took the internet from its inception in around the late 80s to almost now to have a really big impact and disruptive force on businesses, right? So when it first came out, people were saying in the 90s that it's going to blow these businesses up, everything's going to go to zero if you're not on the internet, et cetera, et cetera. But besides these media organizations that saw disruption earlier on, it's only until now that you start seeing more brick and mortar businesses that are going out of business because of it, right? So the Toys R Us's of the world that are going bankrupt because of the internet. So the reason why I say this is because I believe that we're earlier on in blockchain than what some people think. Some people are seeing the massive increase of Bitcoin, the massive increase of these cryptocurrencies as a sign that, hey, we're in the mid-90s of the internet revolution, right? We're in similar stage. But the way I've seen the technology develop, it's really, I think a better analogy is more of the late 80s, where we're still developing the web server, still developing these fundamental technologies that are going to make it run, right? Particularly on the public end, there's still a lot of technological innovations that are down the road that still haven't been put to use yet, right? And so, I mean, I think these panels are sometimes more helpful to have a more skeptical perspective, but from a skeptical perspective, you can really see it taking more than just a couple years for the public blockchain to become a thing. You can really see it taking more like 5 to 10 years, potentially, depending on how quickly it develops. On the private side, you do see an emergence, or starting to see an emergence of companies putting to use. Just to name a few, DTCC is putting their credit default swaps on that's $1 trillion worth of securities, by the way, on a blockchain platform. ASX in Australia recently announced that they're putting their entire cash equities exchange onto a blockchain platform. The private sector and the private blockchain are probably sooner down the pipeline than anything else. But I would definitely say that it helps to be a little bit of a skeptic and be more informed about what are the actual technological barriers to at least the public blockchain adoption, because there are some things that people need to be aware of, which I'm sure we'll talk about as far as the risks in the space. And,
we're going to risks. Yeah. But let me ask for any of you. Let's suppose I'm a technophobe, don't understand blockchain, don't want to delve into it. How do I notice the difference? Is this just, it's all back office stuff that makes no difference to me?
Yeah.
You won't even know you're using it.
Yep.
It takes a little bit of an understanding shift when you think about sort of when you're using these applications. Sometimes things require transactions and you have to pay transaction costs, which you often don't with a lot of applications that we use, and so you can do things infinitely without any personal repercussions. But it forces you to sort of think, do I actually want to take this action with regards to this application or not? So I think, like most of you said, we won't. Ideally, my grandma won't actually notice she's interacting with a blockchain application. It'll just be on her phone. But there will be, I think, some paradigm shifting in terms of the way that we understand applications and think about them and the intermediaries that are actually managing them.
Now, I mean, if you take that phone analogy, you did notice things like all of a sudden, hey, I can get sports scores and I can send messages to people and things that you couldn't necessarily do before. Is it going to affect us sort of that way? Is it new capabilities, or is it just that things are working more efficiently?
I think it's going to be a business model change. So I don't think that we will necessarily see, so right now, again, as a point of reference, today the way that we're acting with blockchain is that you see the price jump and you're like, how do I get in on that, right? And you realize
the
like,
Bitcoin
okay,
thing.
yeah, exactly. So like, again, the point of reference right now, the closest way that you and I can interact with this is through a use case of payments and settlements that is buying Bitcoin on the Bitcoin protocol. There's a whole variety of other utilities that are outside of the realm of payments and settlements that really we're talking about here. But right now today, it's actually very difficult. There's a lot of friction to onboard into the protocol, right? Just even to buy Bitcoin. You go to Coinbase and you're like, okay, that wasn't too bad. I created a user account. I've got my Bitcoin. What do I do with it now? Or like, I heard this other currency is pretty hot and I want to get in on that, but they don't have it on Coinbase. How do I move my Bitcoin to another exchange to buy this other crypto, and then I want to cash out? And
you can't just hit the launder money button? Sorry, I don't buy it. Sorry.
Yeah. But yeah, like it's not easy right now, but eventually what we're going to see is that this is going to be a back office technology that's kind of ticking behind the curtain. And what we as end users and participants in the system will really feel is going to be slight differences in the way the business models that we interact with change. So for example, I do fully expect within the next 2 years that incoming associates in law firms will have to have a computer science familiarity. They may not have to code, but they will have to be comfortable with looking at something and at least understanding the architecture of machine-readable languages. And that's because the prevalence of smart contracts, which is a functionality essentially like a self-executing legal agreement that's facilitated with this technology, smart contracts will come into much a stronger prevalence. And so as lawyers are thinking about the way that they do their job in creating, executing, and arbitrating contracts, they're going to have to get a little bit deeper into the weeds from a technological perspective. And so that's going to change the business model of the way that industries work, or even just simple transactions are executed. And so I think we as end users will see that a little bit, but we actually won't be worried so much about, I need X amount of gas for my, Ethereum transaction to process. That's the stuff that if you're creating a good blockchain company, you need to solve for that as an entrepreneur, because I, as your end user, don't want to be bothered with that, and I'm not going to be quite honest. So I expect founders to be solving for those problems.
So, Mark, the context might be a decent segue. I want to make sure we've heard a bit about what Illinois does. Tell me what you're working on and bounties.
Yeah, so the idea of bounties obviously have existed for thousands of years. Basically, the premise is you say, here's how much money I'm willing to pay for someone to complete some sort of task. And so what we've done is built a system for people to outsource any task, paying in any cryptocurrency that exists on the Ethereum blockchain. And so it does really interesting things when you start to see teams that have done ICOs or token offerings who have a lot of their own native tokens that would power their applications, but actually have to go towards building them. And so using the bounties network, they can actually outsource components of what they need to build, paying in their own native tokens, which aligns a lot of the incentives of the teams that are doing the work and obviously the teams that are issuing bounties. But also then we start to tackle different issues of trust. How do you know someone's actually paid you, and managing that transaction, and arbitration, like you mentioned earlier. And so we start to get into these problems that didn't really exist before. In the Web 2.0 type freelancing services, your reputation score on Upwork, let's say, doesn't obviously transfer to your Uber. And so these reputations are sort of existing in these walled gardens, if you will. And so what we're trying to build is a way for any of these gig economy type applications to be able to be powered by the same sort of underlying architecture, so that when you build up a reputation and have to go into claims, it's trivially easy.
So this is how you're sort of dealing with. Because I was wondering, when you're talking about sort of cutting out the middle person, and you guys gave the real estate example earlier. The real estate agent does a number of things. One is sort of verifying transactions, but sometimes it's sort of passing on information, their specialized knowledge. I don't know if you're talking about sort of cutting out the middleman completely, but is there a loss to that? And do we worry? And you talk about quality in these things. Where does that factor in?
Yeah, so I mean, right now, if you use a freelancing service, they actually escrow the funds for you, and in the event of a dispute, they can actually act as the arbiter for you in a centralized manner. And they also take really high fees. They take like 20% network fees for the transactions. Because we're running on the Ethereum blockchain, we don't have to, be the payments processor. We can drop those fees to zero and have it just be gas costs, obviously, to use the network. And so then we have to start to think as a business, where is our value coming from? How can we generate revenue, and look to different types of services to go beyond what's been done in a Web 2.0 context. So it is sort of a disrupting model or disintermediating these services like Upwork or Fiverr, in that we're not custodians of the funds. The funds live in smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain. If somebody doesn't pay you, we can help facilitate, trying to recuperate your funds, but ultimately we don't have any say in actually controlling those transactions. So it changes a little bit because you start to have to think about trust and protect against the different nefarious behaviors of different actors in the system. But hopefully the user experience can be improved over time well enough that users won't actually notice the difference. But in effect, we'll be paying a lot less for the services. Okay,
so the cost savings. I deferred you earlier the discussion of risks. So we've gotten enthused here. Where are the risks in blockchain?
So I think it helps to understand why I'm very conscious about the risk just based off my background. So the reason why I'm particularly concerned about risk, it's this thing that I think about is, as someone who's running our blockchain initiatives at a investment research firm, I often think about blockchain in terms of an investment, right? So if we're thinking about investment, we also thinking about opportunity costs, as in what other things could I be investing my money in that's not necessarily blockchain, and what does blockchain have to offer that provides me some additional return against what other opportunities are out there. So the reason why I bring up risk is because whenever you're thinking about an investment opportunity, particularly for a business, you have to think about what are ways that things can go wrong. And I think there are a lot of different areas where blockchain has a lot of gray area. So I listed technology as an example where I think scale and ability to process transactions is still a challenge for public networks. And I think there's a whole litany of other things that we can go through, as in just line item by line item. So as an example, governance is a big challenge where you see a lot of these public blockchains having conflicts within their developer groups, right? I think Tezos is one example here where literally the founder in Switzerland of the group of founders is having competing lawsuits against the custodian of their funds, right? And they raised $200 million to create a new blockchain, right? And things like that are happening all the time. And from a governance perspective, that's pretty worrying, right? You don't want someone who's developing your new age platform like Ethereum or Bitcoin to be arguing about, who gets the money or who gets the share. That's not what you want to see. And besides that, there are the more solvable issues, which I think my fellow panelists have touched on already, which is how do you make these things useful and integrated in what people are already doing in day-to-day life, right? So I agree with them in the sense that you shouldn't have to know that you're operating a blockchain, but whenever I try to use a decentralized application, that's what tends to happen. So if I were to list out the biggest worries that I think someone looking at the space would have, I think those are some of the top ones right there. But
going, and it opens up to you two in a second, but going back to your earlier distinction, these are risks on what sits on top of blockchain, not risks of blockchain. Is that right?
I would say both, because for the applications, that sits on top of blockchain. So that's what you're interacting with, and yeah, that certainly has various security issues and interactivity issues. But the underlying protocol still needs development as well. As we know, Bitcoin and Ethereum can only process 3 to 7 transactions a second. I think Ethereum top out at 10 transactions per second overall. And if you know anything about databases, you know that's painfully slow. You can't run a database in any company with that transaction per second, let alone a global network that's trying to process multiple applications at the same time. So there are developments being put into place, particularly with Ethereum, that they have a very comprehensive roadmap to solve these problems, but there's no guarantee that they'll actually solve them. And you want to make sure each step of the way that the governance is there to support them each step of the way, where the leaders are making the right decisions, the stakeholders are acting in the best interest of the network and not their own pocketbooks. Those are all things you want to see, and those are all things that are not for certain. And I think that's why you really need to have a close microscope to the space as it moves forward, because you're going to see examples like Tezos 10 times over in the next coming years. So it's going to be it's the Wild West, and it's still going to be the Wild West.
Okay, Wild West.
In my opinion, what I see, with a lot of people participating in these coin offerings or different, buying different cryptocurrencies, the biggest risk in my mind is that people have a lot of belief in these teams and these founders who promise a lot and who try to imagine these glorious systems that would work in some utopian societies. But in reality, if you look at the teams or the actual technology that they're building, there isn't a lot of actual technical backup there, and I personally am not very confident in a lot of these teams in actually executing what they've promised. And so the big risk in my mind is that a lot of people are relying on the actual execution of these roadmaps where they don't even understand what would actually have to go into building these systems and don't really understand what's being built in general. And so, and people...
Would failure to execute mean the project doesn't come online in time, or does it mean that it doesn't work the way it's supposed to.
It's more of it doesn't work in the way it's supposed to, or doesn't end up having features that they promise. And the problem with the blockchain world is that it moves very, very quickly. And so when you have systems that are trying to outcompete each other, but take a very, very long time, in the end you might have a different competitor come in and step in and actually adopt the same feature set that you were building, but better than you did. In the end, it won't matter because the network effects will be lost. And so going back to the big risk in my mind is that people aren't actually taking the time to do the research. They're just sort of listening to what other people are saying about each of these different projects. And so I would encourage anybody listening who's thinking about buying different cryptocurrencies or looking at different projects is actually do the research yourself. Don't rely on other people's wisdom because a lot of people really don't understand what they're talking about, but pretend like they do.
Oh, we do though. We do.
Yeah, you've always got Morningstar. But for people doing the research, this is a fairly new field. What are you looking at? It's not like you've got decades of experience in blockchain. What do you look for?
Team is really important. Looking at what has the team built in the past, and really how quickly are they applying themselves in the future? Have they built anything yet to prove that they have at least some merit in executing on what they're planning? But also just sort of following up with them on a regular basis. You can often see different teams. If you guys are familiar with GitHub, a lot of the projects that are building in this space are working in an open source capacity. You can see what they're pushing to these open source repos and who is and who isn't actually moving forward on the roadmaps. And no one's really doing the time to actually do that research, but it's all there. And so looking past the white paper, looking past the press releases, and really actually understanding and analyzing the day-to-day work and on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, really keeping up with these teams, and that will help you, I think, stay ahead of teams that might not be executing properly.
And when you do that, you will notice that things are not perhaps moving as fast as the founding team would like them to. There is a lot of noise out there, and to Mark's point, it does take a lot of time and a fair amount of expertise to separate signal from noise. But let's be clear, there's a little bit of signal. There's a little bit out there. And then there's a lot of vaporware. There's a lot of folks that can whip up a 5-page white paper, throw a token on an ICO. And when you read that white paper, if you actually read some of these things.
Initial coin offerings.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, initial coin offering. Some of these things, when you read them, you're reading it and you're like, I don't understand this. Wow, these guys are really smart. And it's not that. It's, I don't understand this because I've just read word salad and this doesn't mean anything. Meta this and that and distributed and some newfangled consensus mechanism that they made up when they were drunk last weekend. These things, it's fair to be very critical. And it's also fair to, be thoughtful to say, it's not just that I don't get it. It's just that, is this that maybe it doesn't make sense at all? So I would say, yes, do your homework, do your research, read these white papers, read them critically and be confident to say, I don't get this. Is it me or is it them? But I would also say, too, when we think about the technology and the promise for the technology, blockchain is not a new technology in the sense that it created a completely new technology that had never been utilized in part before. And what I mean by that is, at its core, blockchain is a distributed consensus mechanism with an underlying security protocol. So if you break down those three things, distribution, essentially nodes and networks, consensus mechanisms, how do we make decisions about data and information, and underlying security protocol, which is cryptography in this case, all of those three things existed before. We didn't create some kind of alien technology that just is blockchain. We put together pieces of technology that have been tried and tested, and we put them together in a new way, and that is blockchain. So when you evaluate things, if you kind of break it down in that framework or other frameworks that may work for you, that's the one that works for me, but I try to evaluate it in that framework to say, what are you doing with regard to these three pieces? And does that make sense? And let's be clear, I'm not a technologist. And throwing back to the other point, I'm learning reams of information every day. So I'm not going to sit here on this stage and tell you that I know everything. I have just had the privilege of sitting in a position where I have been able to interact with a significant amount of these industry participants and spend time with the technology. So as a non-technologist, I like to ask questions to, again, bring this down into Aunt Charlene at Thanksgiving. what are you talking about? What does this do? Why is it better? And especially considering I'm a government official, why should the state be thinking about this?
And just to add on top of that, one of the things I would recommend is if you're reading a white paper, as you said, and you're really not understanding it, try to think of whether or not the author of the white paper actually even understands what they're talking about. Oftentimes you'll hear if people can't understand or can't explain something very simply, they often don't understand it properly themselves. And so a lot of white papers will make things overly complicated to confuse you, purposefully, which is, one of the oldest charlatan tricks in the book. So be wary of that and really keep your eyes open for things that seem too confusing, because if it's a simple concept that's being expressed in a confusing manner, they're often trying to do that on purpose.
Okay, I'm going to want to go to audience questions in just a moment. But last question, since sort of pay the rent, we're Council on Global Affairs here. I want to think global for a second. We're seeing stories in the paper that the Bitcoin thing is being driven by Japanese males who are, getting inordinately enthused. But that image aside, how should we think about sort of the global aspects of this? Is this, a truly global network? What about the governance question? So a quick take on the global aspects, and then all of you can start getting your questions ready.
I think there's a lot of massive geopolitical implications of these technologies. Russia is getting really into Ethereum and trying to think of how they can build distributed versions or trustless versions of a lot of their systems, voting being one of them. China's looking very deeply into it. And so you see a lot of these governments who don't want to move too quickly because they know that there are real implications of the decisions that they'd make, in banning ICOs or, really striking down in a regulatory sense. So, like you guys are doing in Illinois, a lot of governments are trying to foster the innovation and trying to, become the country or the state that is the home of blockchain. You see that in Mauritius, you see that in Dubai and a number of other countries. So, I think it's very early in terms of our analysis of the geopolitical implications, but there are going to be massive, massive implications.
We see a lot in the public sector. The Illinois Blockchain Initiative is going to be publishing a database of public sector use cases throughout the world. Right now, we've got about 178 that we've been able to capture. So let's be clear, not just Illinois, we're working on 5 right now, or Delaware that had kicked us off 2 years ago with the incorporation or the incorporation of company documents. There are so many players elsewhere that are working on this. So some of the folks that surprised us in terms of how much they're doing, the Netherlands are running about 22 use cases right now. Australia has about 10 that they're exploring. Obviously, Russia's doing a lot right now. The country of Georgia is very active. You see a lot of quick forward momentum with smaller countries and also with countries that have more control over how they are able to administer decisions, so they can just say, like in Dubai and the work that Consensus is doing, we are going to be fully blockchain-enabled public sector by this year, and we're going to partner with a great technology company. I'm just going to pump you up a little bit right here. So like day job versus the sidekick that you're doing. But Consensus is basically running, I think it's going to be 32 use cases in Dubai that they're essentially putting the majority of government services on the Ethereum blockchain. And they will close this deal, and we will have 32 public sector use cases working, alive, kicking, active in Dubai, and Dubai will leapfrog ahead. So there's a lot going on in many different places. Just to kind of scope out what this exploration opportunity means to Illinois, we firmly believe that we need to explore this technology. We see the opportunity that it presents to, again, provide our services better, faster, more securely. But our approach is going to be identifying discrete use cases with small groups of participants, mostly using test or dummy data, redundantly with the current process, and be able to explore what those results look like. We're going to get a plethora of good, bad, and ugly out of the back of those explorations, and then we're going to learn. And if it worked out well, we'll expand scope and try and broaden this and move this to an active support for public sector services. And if it doesn't, then we can very easily walk it back, make some changes, and try again. But we're taking a more targeted approach here in Illinois because we really are angling for that pragmatic application.
So, quick comment, because I know we want to get to questions here, but it's to take this question from a different angle. It's worth wondering, why is it that all these governments are suddenly so concerned about cryptocurrencies? And why are they gaming in the first place? Is it because they're bored and have nothing else to do on their Saturdays? Or does it actually represent something disruptive to what they're doing? And I think the conclusion is that a lot of these governments are seeing this technology as taking the place of things that they're used to being the only player in the market for. Right? So think about trust in a currency. Think about distributing, regulating securities. These are things that governments no longer have a strong handle over if there's a strong distributed network like Ethereum or Bitcoin out in the world. Now you have applications that can be run without a central server that a group of governments or even a coalition of governments that are larger can shut down easily. So that's just worth keeping in mind because I think that has some very disruptive implications for whether or not governments can actually truly handle this type of change moving forward.
There's just one comment on this, that's the part I've written on. There is the fact that part of the way governments addressed crime, counterterrorism, and the like is know your customer. So that the fact that you have sort of an intermediary role, if you talk in the cryptocurrency world, you may well be cutting out banks, but banks were supposed to do something along the way.
Yep.
And they were supposed to know your customer. If somebody came in with $100,000 of cash and said, can you please move this along for me, you were supposed to report that. I don't know whether that one is sort of putting the governments out of business, but the other is sort of blocking them from a role that they may have thought was important.
And to that point, you really have to reshift how people are thinking about the laws and rules, and not just the laws that are written on paper, but the informal rules that people know and believe on a day-to-day basis, right? So I think the ways that people think of interacting with others, that someone has to be responsible when something bad goes wrong, right? To your point, if someone steals my money, or if something goes bad with my investments and things like that, in a typical world like the U.S., we like lawsuits a lot. There's always someone to sue. There's always someone to blame. When it comes to centralized applications, that goes out the window. And I think that has implications both for the individual, but all the way up to governments, where you no longer have a clear framework for being able to create legal guidelines around that. So I was listening into the SEC try to ask questions on these cryptocurrency experts and these blockchain experts on how do you actually regulate Bitcoin. And one of their key questions is investing Bitcoin an investment contract, right? And is if you buy Bitcoin, is someone out there writing a contract with you in case if Bitcoin goes bad, you can then sue them for it going bad? And the answer is really, you could technically say the developers are, you could technically say the miners are, but really there's no real person to be suing, quote unquote. So that's really what's disruptive about this, is because you have to rethink how these centralized operating models work.
But to be clear, though, I'm going to actually take the other side of that trade. I don't think that governments are going to be disruptive, and this is obviously coming from your public sector officials up here, but as a bit of background, I've been in the public sector for 2 years. I was in the private sector for over a decade. So I have no love lost with the government doing more or less of the role that it has today. But governments have a very particular role to play. Governments are, whether you're political or not, government is a trusted institution. You don't think twice that you get your driver's license from the DMV. You don't think twice that you have your birth certificate that's held at state and municipal level. You guys don't even think about that. You just know that you get your identity from government. There are a variety of other responsibilities that government holds. Many of them are record keeping. You don't think twice that your deed to your home or your car is held with a government agency. Those roles will continue to be played by government. I believe that the technology will facilitate a better provision of services within that government responsibility, but I do not see a day when government is decentralized, because government has too many roles to play to be entirely decentralized.
All right, with the role of government, we've been having fun up here. I want to sort of share a little bit. This gentleman right here, let's take the first question.
Hi, so getting back to what could go wrong, I'm just thinking about the underlying security protocol, and I'm thinking about quantum computing. So it seems like the basic security algorithms that everything is built on runs on a standard algorithm. When we have hackers with infinitely more computing resources, does that threaten kind of not just blockchain, but our kind of whole ecosystem? So just curious how you see that playing out over time.
So to answer your question, yeah, Bitcoin and Ethereum and a lot of other different blockchains rely on the SHA-256 hashing function, which generates or goes from private keys to generate the public keys necessary to sign transactions on these cryptocurrency networks. So when you talk about a quantum computer breaking into someone's cryptocurrency account, all you're talking about is deriving those keys. Now, talking to people who actually work in the quantum computing space, they tell me that it's we're very far away, so this isn't an immediate problem anyways. But further than that, a lot of the time that the way that these systems are built, it would actually be possible to transition to new different types of hashing functions, or because there are hashing functions that are quantum proof that can't be broken, even if we did have quantum computers with infinitely more computing power. So I think it's like a bit of a red herring. It's a bit of a misnomer that we can be very afraid of this happening, but in actuality, the second that it happens, Satoshi Nakamoto has the largest Bitcoin balance of anybody. And so that's really the private key you want to break. And so as soon as anybody touches it, people will know that someone has gotten their hands on a quantum computer, or likely has gotten their hands on a quantum computer. And I think that fear will cause a massive shift into new hashing functions that are quantum proof. So it seems like a bit of a big problem, but I think in reality it's not as fearful as it should be.
Let's see. Right over here, please.
So I have a more pragmatic question, but also about security. You talked about credit cards as opposed to sort of Bitcoin and things like that. There's a lot of banks and card industry people who will, if you get hacked or somebody steals your identity, will pay you back that $1,000 that you lost, or that $500 that you lost. In this world that we're sort of imagining going to, who's going to be the big player that's going to make the end user consumer feel whole and not feel afraid?
That's a great question. And the reason why it's a great question is because I actually work very closely with our analyst on Visa. So, as you know, we're an investment research company. We cover all of these typical equities that you're familiar with. And the one who works with Visa is probably the most familiar of cryptocurrencies of any of the folks I work with. And I think based off our conversation that we had, I think one thing to note about the development of these cryptocurrencies and developing these decentralized applications is that really existing companies have what we call very large moats that decentralized applications need to cross. Going back to our point earlier about how these applications have a lot to prove before they become battle tested. This is just that's just one of the examples where there's an existing layer of trust of not just the function but also the brand, right? So if everyone knows what Visa is, everyone trusts Visa to give you back your money, or whatever company gave you credit card to give you back your money if something bad goes wrong. Right, so that's what we call part of their economic moat that makes it so hard for existing players like not even just decentralized applications, but traditional companies like Google, Apple, trying to break into the payment market. They can't even do it just because for that reason, right? And thinking about how decentralized applications can cross that moat, they have that same problem. They have to figure out ways to do it. And you can't really say anyone's really figured it out yet. And so that's something to watch out for moving forward is, can they cross this trust barrier that makes it so that they can somehow replace existing services like that? Because I think that's an excellent example of why it's good to think twice about some of the claims that people have about payments going out the window and Bitcoin being the one payment method for everyone.
And to add on top of that, I think there's a number of the functionalities that we get from trusted parties like banks. For example, if I lose my my bank PIN, I can go into a branch and they can help me reset it. Those types of functionalities are being worked on. Uport, for example, is one of the identity solutions coming out of Consensus, and they're building a backup system such that if you lose your password or your phone, that you can actually return to your account using the help of your friends or your trusted, acquaintances. And so there are decentralized manners of actually solving these problems without relying on a bank or one intermediary. For example, in the context of, someone stole my Ethereum wallet and transferred away all my Ether, maybe in 10 years we'll have private key insurance so that I'm insured for up to, let's say, X amount, that if anyone ever steals my wallet and transfers away the money, this trusted insurer of mine will recuperate that. And so there's all of these different types of functions that will probably be taken over by individual applications or service providers, but it won't be one trusted entity that manages that moat, as you referred to it. It'll probably be a subset of different service providers.
Okay, so I'd be particularly remiss if I neglected online questions in the midst of our technology discussion. So one popular one, which I think is begging for an application of what we've been talking about, please explain how blockchain can replace Equifax.
Digital identity.
Ooh.
That's a really good one.
So,
How would something like that work?
yeah, so this is what I get really excited about is digital identity. So essentially, the problem with Equifax was that I'm not a client of Equifax. I don't pay Equifax a fee to hold my personal financial data, that I just am forced to interact with Equifax, and my data is housed in Equifax to allow me to interact with other institutions like a Banana Republic when I apply for a credit card there, or a mortgage with Chase Bank when I want to buy a house. But I'm not actually a customer of Equifax. So the problem that we're seeing here is that my personal sensitive data is being housed by a third party that I'm not even a client of. But they house that because eventually I will be a client of one of their clients, and they need to verify it. So essentially, here again, we have an intermediary that's acting as a trusted broker to sit in the middle of a transaction to say that Jennifer has a high credit rating and you should allow her to take out debt to buy a house or take out debt to buy a dress. But at the end of the day, this is my information. It's my credit score that I've earned because of my financial history and my transactions. Can we imagine a future where I hold that information, not Equifax? And to be quite honest, we can, and it's not that far away. Through this digital identity architecture of decentralized IDs and verifiable claims that a variety of different blockchains are able to functionally utilize, you as an individual can be the owner of your own data, and then you can share it with whom and for however long you want. Now again, let's time box this. This is not happening tomorrow. We need to put the infrastructure into place. We need to put the rails in place to create essentially the Visa and MasterCards of digital identities, so that when holding my personal digital identity information on my cell phone, when I want to interact with, whether it's my bank, my government, or whomever, it's going to take a while for all of those participants to stand up onto a system so that we have that larger Visa, MasterCard rails of digital identity in place. But there absolutely is the architecture and the functionality that allows us to hold our own data so that the next Equifax or even Target credit card doesn't happen.
Okay, great. Let's see, question right over here in the corner. Wait for the microphone over you, right there.
Next slide. Yeah, I'm horrified at the prospect of reading 50 white papers just to get going on understanding this. So I was wondering if any of you would be willing to indicate to us what you think the most compelling competitors to Bitcoin and Ethereum are.
So this is interesting, is 2017 is a year that's littered with Ethereum competitors. You have a ton of these teams coming out of the woodwork claiming that they can build Ethereum, a protocol that has taken, I think, 3 years at this point to be built and has this, developer ecosystem, this large group of developers, myself included, who are building these applications on top of it, and who are developing these network effects. And so when you think about competitors to Ethereum in terms of being able to facilitate the network effects of applications, where it's not only just the network effects of users, but the value of each application on Ethereum is increased the more of these applications that are existing on the same network. And so being able to replicate that alone, I think, is very, very challenging just to think of. But on top of that, you also have to rebuild all the technology, create this developer ecosystem where you have, Ethereum, for example, has, I think, 5 different languages their clients are built in with. Each has their own different open source community that's maintaining that and making sure it's secure. And when you look at these competitors, often their teams will be, maybe 20 people, 15 of which are, biz dev, and 5 developers who are actually supposed to build the system. And so when you logically think through it, it doesn't really make sense. So I think it's very easy for David to say that he's the same as Goliath or to compare themselves as equals. But when you actually start to look through the implementations of what they're trying to discuss, it doesn't really make sense. So when you asked what are the biggest competitors of Bitcoin or blockchain, I don't think Bitcoin's ever going to go anywhere. Bitcoin's always going to be the first blockchain, and we'll always look back to it as that. And if you're looking at public distributed application blockchains, I don't think anyone's going to beat Ethereum.
So one thing I would add to that, though, is just to use a very simple rule of thumb here. I would quote my favorite author, Nassim Taleb, as in using the Lindy effect, which is, I would take the Lindy effect is essentially anything that's lasted to a certain point in time is probably going to last further for the similar period of time. And I think that's very applicable to blockchains because you really want to see the actual application operating in a potentially hostile environment before you're making bets on it, right? So a lot to your point, Mark, a lot of people are making claims, but can it actually prove those claims in a live environment where people are actively trying to attack the network, which happened tons of times to Bitcoin, Ethereum when they were coming out, right? So can they survive those attacks? And really, all you have to do is just wait and see. If you don't want to read through 50 white papers, all you have to do is just wait and see if these applications can actually prove themselves out and not get destroyed, because that's a very real risk. There are people all the time trying to hack these networks. And you will see very soon whether or not they're true to their claims, because either they're going to have shortcuts built into the system that they're going to say is eventually going to be fixed. I'm not going to name any names there, or they're just going to say, oh, we're not ready yet. We're still building it, right? They're not going to have a live network that's doing all the things that they said they're going to do. So you're going to see that, and I think you don't have to read the white papers to see whether or not they're actually working.
Okay, as we're running very short on time, I want to slip in one more question, different angle, but a very popular question. Mining for Bitcoin alone uses the same amount of energy as Denmark. Do you see a collision with environmental concerns between sort of mining and environmental issues?
I do, and I think it's really important because what we will see as an unintended consequence of mining and the increase in mining because of the increase in the value of these cryptocurrencies is that we essentially should be racing to the finish to find renewable energy resources. And now we are highly incentivized to figure out renewable energy so that you can mine to your heart's desire. And then also force the protocols to evolve and mature and figure out how they're going to evolve their proof of work, which is essentially the security function that drives the mining requirement. Mm-hmm. You essentially strengthen and harden the system with this unintended consequence of seeking renewable energy resources.
So the way that the Bitcoin network is secured with mining, it's basically a competition where you need 51% of the mining power, the hash power of the entire network to be able to change anything in the ledger. And that obviously is very difficult because 51% of all that computing power is an infinite, not infinite, but it's an unsurmountable amount of actual computing power. No one has that. And so that's why the Bitcoin network is so secure. But Ethereum is looking to introduce this idea called proof of stake, where instead of having $1,000 worth of computing power on my node, I can actually just have $1,000 worth of value of Ether or of possibly other currencies being staked. And so I can use that sort of as a security check or use that to verify my trustworthiness. And so if you wanted to attack a proof of stake network, instead of having 51% of the computing power, you'd need 51% of the actual value of all those the tokens being staked. And that is obviously far more difficult to accumulate than just the computing power itself. So there are obviously updates coming in the future, and I think 2018 will be a fruitful year for that.
Okay, good. Well, I know you all have more questions, I have more questions, but we don't have more time. So please join me in thanking all of our guests for sharing their expertise. Great job. And we are adjourned.